أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This is study number 25 of the Ramadan daily Quran studies for the year 2022, presented by myself, Zahid Aziz, on behalf of the Ahmadiyya Anjuman Ishat Islam Lahore, UK. We're continuing with the topic of the pilgrimage or Hajj. The Hajj was a recognized institution in Islam in the first and second years of the Hijrah, and that is before the start of the battles between the Muslims and the Quraysh of Makkah. The second chapter of the Quran, Surah Baqarah, it was revealed mostly in years 1 to 2 of the Hijrah, and it's full of directions relating to Hajj. And the context there shows that fighting between Muslims and the Quraysh had not actually taken place, although prospects of such fighting were in sight. There is a clear command to perform the Hajj at the beginning of a verse in Surah Baqarah as follows. And I'll only read the beginning of that verse. وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْأُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ. And those clear words mean, and accomplish the Hajj and the Umrah for Allah. Chapter 2, verse 196. So this mentions both the Hajj, which is performed at a fixed time in the Muslim calendar, and also the minor pilgrimage or the visit, the Umrah, which can be done at any time of the year and has fewer rites and ceremonies than the full Hajj. So that was in verse 196 of chapter 2. The rules of conduct to be observed on Hajj and other rules and features are then mentioned in the subsequent verses from 196 to 203. And even before any of this, Hajj and Umrah are mentioned in verse 158. And that verse, or the first part of it, runs as follows. Inna safa wal marwata min sha'irillahi faman hajjil baita awif tamara fala junaha alayhi yatawafa bihima. Which is the Safa and the Marwa are truly among the signs of Allah. So whoever makes a pilgrimage to the house, to the Bath, to the house of God, to the Kaaba, or pays a visit to it, so this mentions both the Hajj and the Umrah, there is no blame on him if he goes round them. That is to say, round the Safa and Marwa. And the reason why it says here there is no blame on them is that some Muslims of Medina were reluctant to perform the act of running between the Safa and the Marwa, probably because at that time there were idols of stone placed on those two spots by the idol worshippers of Makkah, who then had control of Makkah. But the Holy Quran told Muslims that the presence of idols there did not make it wrong for Muslims to perform this rite. So the odd individual Muslim who could get there and perform the pilgrimage or Umrah while Makkah was still in the hands of the disbelievers, he could run between Safa and Marwa, regardless of the fact that there were idols there on both mountains. The earliest verse, or verses, I should say, giving Muslims permission to fight in self-defense, they are in Surah Baqarah, numbers 190 to 193. But Hajj has been mentioned before this in verse 158, and indeed in another one, 189. So this shows that that allegation of the critics of Islam is false, that the Holy Prophet thought of incorporating Hajj into Islam after the Muslims had won the Battle of Badr, because he could then see the prospect in the future of Muslim conquering Mecca. So the Surah Baqarah mentioned Hajj and Umrah and various rules relating to them even before the verses were revealed, allowing Muslims to fight. And of course, the Battle of Badr then took place subsequently. Now, Islam discourages what's called asceticism in all its aspects. Asceticism is the practice of cutting yourself off from the world for religious purposes and living a life devoted to worship, as in a monastery. But still, Islam lays the greatest stress on the spiritual development of man. And if we look at its four main institutions, which are prayer, zakat, fasting, and Hajj, what Islam has done is to introduce workable ascetic formula into daily life, workable formula for asceticism, but combined or mixed into one's daily life. And asceticism which fits in with the practical side of life. And if we look at the other practices other than the Hajj, to perform the 5 daily prayers, we sacrifice a part of our time. And the prayers don't interfere in any way with our everyday lives, but they enable us to realize that we must develop the divine qualities that God has placed in every human being. If we move on to zakat, we must give up a small portion of our wealth, but this does not interfere with our right to own wealth and property. In case of fasting, we give up food and drink, but this is not in such a manner as to make us unfit for carrying on with our regular work or business during the fast itself. And moving on to Hajj, it is only in Hajj that asceticism, or cutting yourself off from the world for religious purposes, it assumes a clear and marked form. The pilgrim is required not only to give up his regular work for a number of days for the sake of the journey to Makkah, but in addition, they must give up many other amenities of life and live more or less the life of an ascetic. The Hajj is, of course, a function which generally comes only once in one's lifetime. And therefore, you can clearly see about the Hajj as well, that while it leads a person through the highest spiritual experience, it does not interfere in any appreciable degree with the regular course of the pilgrim's life. No other institution in the world has the wonderful influence of Hajj in leveling all distinctions of race, color, wealth, and rank. Not only do people of all races and all countries meet together in front of the holy house of God as his servants, as members of one divine family, but in addition, they're all wearing the same garments, two white sheets, and there remains nothing to distinguish the high from the low. And there's a vast mass of human beings, all clad in the same garments, all moving in the same direction, and all saying, uttering the same expression, Labaka Allahumma Labaka, meaning, here we are, O Allah, here we are in your great presence. Hajj is usually described in terms of the outward actions that it involves. And usually the real significance and inner value is not mentioned. The deeper value of Hajj is the higher spiritual experience which is made possible by this unique assembly of human beings. And that is the experience of drawing nearer and nearer to God till the pilgrim feels that all those barriers, obstacles, and veils which kept him away from God, he feels that they are entirely removed, and he or she is standing in the very presence of God. Of course, it is true that God does not live in Makkah, nor is the Kaaba the house of God in any material or physical sense. And it is also true that a Muslim is taught to communicate with God through prayer in any remote corner, by himself alone in solitude, in the dead of nights, and therefore all alone he goes through the experience of drawing nearer to God. But there is a higher spiritual experience to which he can attain in that vast assembly of people who gather in the plain of Arafat. Every member of that assembly sets out from his home with that aim in view of being in the presence of God. The pilgrim discards all those comforts of life which act as a veil against our inner vision, our inner sight. The pilgrim is required to put on the simplest dress, to avoid all talk of an amorous, cheap, loving nature, and all kinds of disputes with fellow beings, and to undergo all the hardships involved in an arduous and difficult journey to what to most people is a distant place like Arabia. And all this so that the pilgrim may be able to concentrate all his thinking and meditation on God. The comforts of life are undoubtedly a veil, a barrier which shut out the other world from human sight. And on the other hand, sufferings and difficulties certainly make a person turn to God. And what the aim and object of Hajj is to concentrate all your ideas on God, not in solitude, but in the company of others. So a man may have the company of his wife, yet he must not have any amorous or romantic talk with her. He may be in the company of his enemy, yet he is not allowed to have any quarrel with him. And all this so that he may have a higher spiritual experience. This is not like the spiritual experience of the hermit who is in his hut, cut off from the world. It is not the spiritual experience of the devotee worshipping God in the corner of solitude. It is the spiritual experience of the person living in the world in the company of his spouse, his friends, and his foes and opponents. That is the end of this study. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم آمين